Well, greetings and thank you for attending my presentation entitled From Slavery to Soldier, What Civil War Records Can Tell You About Your Ancestors. I don't know about you, but when I first saw the movie Glory back in 1989, which was roughly 32 years ago, I remember just being in complete awe and astounded by the historical information concerning the participation of African Americans in the Civil War. I really had no idea that we were major contributors to the fight for freedom. I do remember thinking to myself, did my ancestors serve in the Civil War? And if so, is there a historical record? How did the producers of the movie even compile the facts for these events? Were more regiments participating in the war? How did how did how do you even research this data to even find the truth? I mean, I had all kinds of questions swirling through my head, and having been a genealogist for so many years now, I've come to realize that military records are actually a monumental resource of genealogical data, and I really can't overstress that. So hopefully in this presentation, I'll be able to answer some of the questions you have and provide you a historical background of the United States colored troops, the records, their detailed military service and medical histories, and even their genealogies, and how this information can bridge gaps in research and extend your pedigree charts. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so first I'm going to give you a historical timeline of the Civil War and the what, when, where, and how African Americans got involved. So the Civil War initially started in 1861 and ended in 1865. Now, you have to remember that the Union's priority was first to win the war and not lose the border states to secession. Lincoln and the Congress's actions reflected that. Congress had passed two confiscation acts. The first one was that any seizure of rebel property or contraband, in this case would be slaves, would be set free during the war. And the second act, along with the Militia Act, which was passed on July 17, 1862, they freed African Americans and allowed them to participate in the war effort as laborers and soldiers. Additionally, on September 22, 1862, Lincoln had issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which was only aimed at freeing slaves in Confederate states only that were occupied by the Union. And Lincoln had famously said, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. It is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." So you have to really understand, he was not an abolitionist, and he did not see black people necessarily as equal to whites. He was just trying to preserve the Union. So 5 days later, the first of four Negro regiments known as the Louisiana Native Guard were formed to serve in the war. And then on January 1st, 1863, the famous Emancipation Proclamation was issued by Lincoln, which explicitly gave authority to the War Department to publicly recruit African Americans as fully armed soldiers prepared for combat. Within the next 4 to 5 months, the Native Guard was then reorganized into the Court d'Afrique, which was a militia of African Americans. And then the Court d'Afrique had won a significant battle at Port Hudson in Louisiana. Then the Court d'Afrique was then reorganized along with the Native Guard and incorporated officially into the United States military as the United States Colored Troops, or USCT. And those first four Native Guard regiments were then reformed or reorganized as the 73rd, 74th, 75th, and 76th U.S. Colored Regiments. So by the end of the war, nearly 200,000 African Americans had honorably served in the armed forces. Okay, so when it came to the Union Army, the United States military, there were three major record types for review of a soldier's military history. The first is compiled military service records, or what we refer to as CMSRs. Then there's the pension application files that were normally recorded after a soldier's service. And then finally, compiled records showing service of military units in volunteer union organizations, which is located on microfilm publication M594 and can be found at the National Archives. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to focus on the first two. So with compiled military service records, each soldier had one compiled military service record for each regiment that they served in. So you have to keep in mind that sometimes soldiers served in multiple regiments, anywhere from 2 to 5. It just depended. But with all of these different compiled military service records, they would be put in these envelopes or jackets, and they would create abstracts out of them so that the War Department staff could quickly reference them and pull those records if they needed to check for military information or medical information or claims. And in these jackets, you would find information such as muster rolls. These rolls were like morning reports where the soldier would report every morning to their commanding officers for duty, and they would mark them as absent or present or AWOL. Then there were descriptive books which contained the dates of their enlistments for each regiment and when they were either honorably discharged or dishonorably discharged, and sometimes they'd give the reasons why. Also, there were it would show you how much they were being paid for their service, any hospitalization records due to either illness or injuries that they received from participating in the war. But there would also be genealogical information, like information about their birth or their age or where they enlisted, which might give you sometimes clues to where they actually came from, particularly if they had been slaves previously. And also, if they had ever been captured by the enemy, there would also be records indicating that, showing them as prisoners of war. So the other record type is pension application files, and I'm going to be spending a great amount of detail throughout this presentation on these file types, because they are an absolute treasure trove of information for any researcher. That's a given. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that if a soldier was alive during the time he filed a pension, it was normally for a disability pension, or what we would refer to as an invalid pension. And those pensions would contain detailed medical information about a soldier, any injuries he suffered during battle, or if it were illnesses that he suffered after he was already mustered out. But what really makes these files incredible are the widow's pension files, at least in my experience, because widows had to provide an incredible amount of detailed information and history about their relationship to these soldiers if they were the ones to file the pension. Sometimes in cases where the wife was deceased or absent, the children sometimes would file the pensions on behalf of their parents. And in other cases where there was no spouse, there were no children, sometimes dependent parents would file pensions on behalf of their son. And these files could be anywhere up to 100 pages. And the detailed information in there really built off of what you would see in the abstracts of the compiled military service records. So the bulk of the genealogical data that you'd find on any soldier comes from these records. That's why they're so important. And then these pension files have index cards that have been microfilmed, and they are digitized. You can find them at the National Archives in microfilm publication T288, known as the General Index to Pension Files from 1861 to 1934. But nowadays, a lot of them are online, and you can find them on sites like Family Search and Ancestry.com, which I'll get into a little bit later. So the Pension Dependent Act of 1890 extended benefits to women who could prove that they were the widows of Civil War veterans. And as I stated earlier, widows had to go through a lot just to be able to prove their eligibility and prove their relationship to soldiers. And some of the criteria that they would be required to provide were the soldier's discharge papers that showed that he was honorably discharged and that he'd served at least 90 days. Also showing proof of the soldier's death unless it was a result of his military service. And of course, if there wasn't a certificate, they would hope to be able to find the doctor who declared him dead and declared the cause of death and have him produce an affidavit or some kind of written statement. Also, the applicant could not have any means of support other than her day labor. She could not show that she'd received income from any other individual, for instance, a boyfriend or a second husband or so forth. Also, the widow would have to prove her marriage had occurred prior to this act going into effect, and she would have to provide proof of her marriage, hopefully with a marriage certificate recorded with the county, or if that wasn't the case, they would have to provide an affidavit from a minister who could testify that yes, he was the one who married them. And of course, this would be the case particularly with African American women who were enslaved, because a lot of slave marriages were not solemnized and legalized and recorded with the counties prior to the Civil War. So where can you get access to these record types? Well, here I've provided a list of the multiple regional offices for the National Archives that are located around the country. Here we have locations like Washington, D.C. Then there's the regional office in San Bruno, California, which is the Northern California area where I'm from, and I've been to this location. There's also Birmingham, Alabama, the public library there. There's also the National Archives in Chicago, Illinois. There's the Allen County Public Library in Indiana, as well as the Library of Michigan, the New York Public Library, Dallas Public Library, and even the Family History Center in Utah. And lastly, we have the Heritage Quest Research Library in the state of Washington, and then the State Historical Society of Wisconsin. And with all that being said, as I alluded to earlier, a lot of this information is now available online. A great online repository for the compiled military service records, or at least the index, is at the National Park Service website, which is a free website. And if you're just looking to try to figure out if your ancestors were even soldiers, this is a great place to look to see if you can find their regiments and find the time periods in which they served. Also, the index pension cards, as I stated earlier, T288, those are available online with Ancestry, which is a fee-based service. Then there's also Fold 3, which is specifically a website that is a repository for military service records from different eras, World War I, World War II, the American Revolution, and so forth. That is a fee-based service. And then finally, there's the Family Search site, which is free to be able to browse those cards. So the first thing you would have to ask yourself is, well, how would I even be able to deduce that my ancestor had even, participated in the Civil War? Well, the first thing you have to do is figure out time period and age. Was that person old enough or young enough to have been involved in the war effort? The minimum age requirement for the war was 18. So that means, and we know that African Americans primarily, most of them entered the war around the year of 1863. That's where the bulk of them start coming in, and afterwards. So that means they would have had to been born around 1845. But I would even, if you think your ancestor was born around, let's say 1847, I would even still consider it, because we know that some of them lied about their age just so that they could serve. And from there, you would then start searching the indexes that I mentioned before, the National Park Service site and the index cards, especially if when it comes to the pension files, if they did not file a disability pension, maybe there was a widow's pension. If you can identify who their wives were, particularly at the time of their death, those widows may have filed a claim, or the kids, or their parents, and so forth. So the the pension cards are definitely a great resource. Here's a great example of a pension card that comes from the U.S. Civil War Pension Index. This is the pension card of my third grade grandparents. The soldier, my third grade grandfather, Thomas Benton, his wife, my third great grandmother, Artemise Benton, filed this pension, as you can see, around August 8th, 1892. And she indicated the regiments that he served in, which was Company E of Regiment 67 and Regiment 65, Company D of the it says USCINF, which stands for United States Colored Infantry. So he was in the infantry. What you also see here is that it is a widow's pension because they've indicated other details in the widow row, and there you see an application number and a certificate number and the state in which it was filed, which was Louisiana. Now these two pieces, this information here is critical because what you can automatically look at any pension card and see that, okay, the pension was filed, there's the application number that it was filed under. If you see a certificate number, that indicates that there was an award given. This pension was approved, and the claimant, in this case, my third great grandmother, Artemise Benton, was awarded a claim, awarded a pension. If you don't see a certificate number, that normally means that the claim was denied. Now, do not let that discourage you, because sometimes denied claims are the best claims for a genealogical researcher, because it's going to give detailed information as to why that claim was denied. And a lot of it is going to be very, very rich genealogical information. So earlier you heard me talk about volunteer descriptive lists in compiled military service records. Here we have a compiled military service record for my third great grandfather, Thomas Benton, which I discovered on the website fold3.com. This is information that a medical examiner would have filled out on behalf of the soldier who's enlisting, and the medical examiner here extracted this information from Thomas Benton, where Thomas had indicated that he had been the former slave of a Henry McCabe. So that's the first time I'm hearing of a slave owner in my Benton family tree. It also says in red here that Henry McCabe is loyal. What that means is that Henry McCabe was loyal to the Union, not the Confederacy. And this definitely piqued my interest, and I looked up Henry's military service record and discovered that, yes, he had been a lieutenant in the Union Army. So yes, Union soldiers did own slaves. So don't let anyone lie to you and tell you that that didn't happen, because it most definitely did. And Thomas, there's other information here, physical traits of Thomas, as far as him being 23 years old with black hair, black eyes, black complexion. He's about 5'8", and he states that he was born in Polk County, Missouri. So now I have an origin for Thomas, and huge clues for me to continue my research to see if I could find if he had been enslaved in Polk County, Missouri, and if Henry had been his slave owner, then that gives me something definitely to look into. He indicated that he was a farmer and that he enlisted in the military on December 21st, 1863. So here what we have is my other third great grandfather, Jack Penny. See, Thomas Benton's child and Jack Benny's child wed, and they became relatives by marriage. But I had discovered that Jack was also a United States colored troop. Here, these are examples of the muster rolls that I'd mentioned earlier, and these muster rolls indicate this was a regiment. This was a muster roll for Regiment 80, Company G. You could see it's pre-printed, but it indicates Jack's rank on there as corporal in September and October of 1864. Well, by January and February of 1865, he is then promoted to sergeant. So, like I said, every couple of months they have these muster rolls, and these soldiers would report for duty, and it would this is kind of a nice little timeline to give you an idea of what's going on throughout their service period. And then he has his final muster roll where he musters out of the service in New Orleans on January 18th, 1867, at the rank of sergeant. So as I stated earlier, the National Park Service has the Compiled Military Service Index records, and here's an example of my third great grandfather Jack Penny indicating similar information as the muster roll I showed you, where it shows Regiment 80 of the United States Colored Infantry, Company G, and he's at the rank of sergeant here. When you click on that 80th Regiment title, it gives you more detailed information about the regiment, which can be very vital information. So for instance, here it explains that the 80th Regiment was originally organized April 4th, 1864 from the 8th Corps d'Afrique Infantry and attached to garrison at Port Hudson. So this is so as I had mentioned earlier in the presentation, Corps d'Afrique won a major battle at Port Hudson. It turns out that Jack's regiment was a member of the Corps d'Afrique before it was reorganized into the 80th U.S. Colored Regiment. It also goes on to talk about his service or the regiment's service, where it says at Camp Carlton, Camp Parapet in New Orleans. And it also talks about at the end where it says move to Texas and garrison duty at various points in the state till March of 1867 and mustered out March 1st, 1867. That is a key piece of information that will come up later in this presentation about his regiment moving to Texas. Here's Jack Penny's pension card, which lists his wife, Maria Penny. Actually, her name was Mariah Penny. And it shows you information that's consistent with what you saw in the previous slide that shows that he was a member of Company G of Regiment 8 of the Louisiana Corps d'Afrique Infantry, and then also served in Regiment 80, Company G of the United States Colored Infantry. But the other interesting piece of information here is that in September of 1890, he filed an invalid pension. And as you can see, there's a certificate number 1073144, which shows that he won an award for that pension. Then in 1902, his wife then files a widow's pension, which obviously shows you that between 1890 and 1902, obviously Jack died somewhere in between there. She also received an award. So both of these pensions were approved. So that pension card would link you to a pension file such as this one. This is the beginning of Maria Penny's pension file for her husband Jack. As you can see here, there's some information about where she was living at the time, some military information about Jack being a sergeant and what regiment he was in, and it also shows what rate she received or started receiving on April 8th, 1902, which was about $8 a month. At the bottom, we see the approvals. In this approvals section, you see here that obviously it was approved. That's why you would have this data here, but there's some critical pieces of information here, genealogical information that starts painting a picture. The first thing that you would see is that Mariah stated that her husband had no prior marriage. He was not married to anyone before her. That's an important piece of information. And secondly, the claimant says that her marriage to the soldier was on February 28th, 1867. So now we have a marriage date, which is fantastic. So again, treasure trove of information is what you will find here in a pension file. Now this document here is a pretty cool document. It's one of the documents in this file that I personally am most proud of, because it indicates, it's a certificate that indicates that Jack was being promoted from corporal to sergeant. And you know, just when you just sit there and think about that, this man had been a slave and now he's in a leadership position in the military, and they did not give out a lot of military leadership positions to African Americans during the Civil War. So the fact that he was put in a leadership position just says a lot about him and his character And it's just one of those things that I'm really proud of. This is a pretty cool document as well because it's Jack's discharge papers. And it shows, and this is something that would have been very important for Mariah to have in her possession, especially filing for the widow's pension. She would have probably had to show this, where it shows that in January 18th, 1867, he was discharged in New Orleans. And it also indicates that he was born in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. So that's an important piece of information that, again, gives his origins just like we had the origins for Thomas Benton. While going through the application process, Maria must have provided this document, which is the proof of Jack's death. It shows his full name is Jackson Penny, and as I stated earlier, he must have died somewhere between 1890 and 1902 because of when he filed his invalid pension versus when the widow's pension was filed. Well, this shows proof that he died March 24th, 1902. Again, it also reiterates critical piece of information that he was born in Missouri. But it also indicates the birthplace of his mother was Tennessee. Now that's something rare. I don't normally see things like this in a widow's pension file, but yes, sometimes you can actually have the death certificates maybe that you couldn't find filed with the county. They're actually, maybe the only copy is actually placed in the widow's pension file when the spouse, submits the documentation for proof. This is the back side of the document where it just shows that the doctor, Dr. L. Morgan, just indicates that the information that's on the certificate is correct, and he testifies to what is stated here. Now, this was a stunning piece of information to find in this pension file for me. At the top, it says to be returned to claimant at 110 15th Street, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, according to promise. So that was her address. So I'm thinking, well, what is it they're returning to her? Well, apparently she sent a pictograph of Jack to them so that she could identify, show identification of him physically. And, it goes on to say that this was a picture, I guess, taken at Mount Zion Church, and it was with a colored congregation, and he must have been in the front, and it was taken 23 years ago, around 1880. So I thought this was really fascinating information, and of course, it begs to ask the question, what happened to the picture? And was it ever really returned to Mariah? I really don't know. I sure wish I did. So in these pension files, you'll find documents like this where you have an index which provides a list of all of the individuals who were examined for this claim. So these people could either be relatives, friends, neighbors, people within the community who could testify to knowing Mariah and her husband. Maybe some of these people were there when they were married, maybe knew them before them, maybe they were slaves with them. Some of these people will testify to whether they remember when the children were born and things like that. This is all just supporting documentation, and these people would provide affidavits that they would sign. So on the left side, you have the names of the witnesses, and then on the right side, it says reputation. So it's showing that the examiner is grading them, and he's also evaluated them in terms of whether they are known to be of good reputation or bad reputation, whether the information they provided is reliable or not. As you can see, there's a few people like John Alexander who's listed as doubtful. They even refer to him as stupid. That's pretty derogatory, but apparently they didn't necessarily consider him a credible source, even though they took a statement from him. Same thing with Stephen Smith. He's considered unreliable. But there are other people who actually most of them were pretty much in good standing with the examiner. So here's the real meat and potatoes of Civil War pension files. What you're looking at right here is the deposition of my third great grandmother, Mariah Penny. And again, when I talk about treasure troves, when I talk about those treasures are right here in the bulk of these depositions. Examiners for these types of claims, when they're trying to examine a claimant for eligibility, they will get it, dig in and ask detailed questions, personal questions about the claimant and the soldier, how they met and whether they were previously married before or not. But this is where the claimant gets the opportunity to really state their case and tell a lot of detailed and personal information. So that's why I say when it comes to these pension files, they are absolutely incredible. And just to give you an idea of the type of detailed information that can literally tear down brick walls for you, as they did for me, I'm just going to give you a little snippet here of this paragraph where Mariah says, I first saw the soldier before he was mustered out of the service while going from Jonesville, Texas to Marshall, Texas. We got acquainted on the train and he fell in love with me at once and he began writing me afterwards, but we became engaged on the train. I preceded him to Shreveport 2 weeks, and when he got there, I went on the same boat he did from there to New Orleans, and a month after he was mustered out, he married me at the house of his brother, Arch Penny, at St. Anne Street near Dryad Street. So right there, just in those few sentences, you've got an enormous wealth of information here. I mean, when I first read this, I mean, I was just completely blown away by the kind of detail that I'm getting on my third great grandparents. I mentioned earlier that when I referenced when I showed you the National Park Service website and it showed you Jack Penny's regiment and gave you information about some of the expeditions and locations where the regiment went. One of them I said to keep in mind was Marshall, Texas. Well, this explains, or at least gives you more insight into when his regiment went to Marshall, or was on its way to Marshall. This is where he met my third great grandmother. And they fell in love, and she even goes into detail about how she met him all the way in northern Louisiana in Shreveport, hooked up with him there, and then they travel on a boat all the way back down south. And he had a brother, come to find out he has a brother named Archie Penny, also known as Archibald Penny, and Archie's house was in New Orleans, and that was where they got married. So this is just incredible information to find. These pension files can be, 4, 5, 6 pages long, maybe longer, just depending on what kind of detail or what kind of questions that the examiners asked, and also just frankly how talkative the claimants were. And there's another, I didn't put it in here, but there's another document in here where the claimant gives his summary and he talks about how talkative she is, and is just very articulate in the way she explains her life and the soldier's life. So here's additional information on another page where she goes into more detail. She says, I was married under the name of Maria Green, from which was my maiden name, Green, being my father's name. I was born in Macon County, Alabama, 6 miles from the town of Lochapoka. I believe that's how you say it, Lochapoka. We lived right on the line of Tallapoosa County. My father and mother and myself all belonged to Russ Bridges in Alabama, and after the war broke out, they took us to Texas for safekeeping. They lived only 6 miles from Marshall, Texas. I was hired out by a man in Jonesville, Texas named Lang, who was a furniture dealer. The Langs had some small children, but I don't recall the names of any of them. I was only about 15 years old when I married Jack. So again, even more incredible detailed information about their lives. She was 15 when she married him. We now have her maiden name, which was Green, which I have confirmed. I have her death certificate, in which the death certificate says that her parents were Sam and Della Green. She states that she was born in Macon County. And I mean, just think about the detail that she gave in terms of saying what town she was near, 6 miles from that, and near the and near the line of Tallapoosa County. So I was actually able to Google this, and on the next slide, I'll show you where I was kind of able to narrow down the area in which she came from. But again, she also gives you one of the jackpots that all of us who research in African American ancestry, she gives you one of those gold nuggets that we all look for, which is a slave owner's name. So she says she belonged to Russ Bridges from Alabama, or who was in Alabama at that time. It sounds like, reading this, that they may have also lived in Marshall, Texas. So now that gives me more tips to look for Russ Bridges, not only in Alabama, but also in Texas. So here's the Google map of what I was talking about. As you can see in the top right corner, you see Lochapuka, and 6 miles west of there, kind of southwest, is Notasulga. I'm not really sure if that is exactly the area where she lived, but when I looked at the county lines because Lochapuka is in Lee County, then where she came from, there was Macon County, Alabama, and then this county where this high school is. So the county lines kind of intersect right there. So my presumption here is this must be the general area in which she came from. So again, I'm just very blessed to be able to have, this kind of information, and have a third grade grandmother who cared to go into this kind of detail. So the examiner continued to ask her additional questions about the life of her husband, and she gave as much detail as she could. She continues on by saying, he told me he was learned and raised in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. That's consistent with what his discharge paper says. And it says, I suppose it was in the county by that name, but may have been the town he was raised in. He told me he belonged to a man named Penny who raised wheat. He said he used to cut wheat. So again, additional information, critical information. What can I deduce from this? That one, he was a slave, that his slave owner's last name was Penny, that it was more than likely in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, or somewhere near, and that the plantation that he, or the land that he was a slave on, was a wheat farm. So the examiner, as he continued to ask questions about the soldier, he must have asked a question about whether or not he had taken a picture in the army, because Mariah answers, she says, no, sir, the soldier never had a picture taken in the army. He had one taken soon after the war, but he gave that to his mother, Elsie Penny. So, and again, now we've got new additional information. We now know Jack's mother's name. I have seen her name in different records. I've seen it pronounced Elsie. I've also seen Elise. I noticed that her kids and grandkids, they also carried her name and they spelled it different ways. But from just talking to, distant relatives that I've uncovered through my research, most of them said their ancestors' names were Elise. So it's more than likely that was her name, but she could have been called different things. So she continues on the next page that Elsie died, and she says, but I think his brother Arch Penny of Champaign, Illinois, so now we know that Archie has moved from New Orleans to Champaign, Illinois, must have that picture now. The only photograph I have of the soldier was taken 23 years ago, and that was taken while he was at church and nearly asleep. And that picture is badly faded, but still anyone who knew the soldier can see a very striking resemblance between the picture and the soldier. He was sitting outside of the Mount Zion Church with his head down. I will loan you the picture. So that gives the backdrop on the previous slide that I showed you, where she gave that picture to to the examiner for them to have for their records. And I don't exactly know what they did with it, but they must have included it in their um, evaluation or determination. And then once they were done with it, they allegedly sent it back to her. And like I said, I've talked to this information has helped me uncover living relatives that I didn't know that I had, because I've researched um, some, the children of Jack and Elsie. I'm sorry, of Jack and Maria. And I've asked a lot of them if they ever knew anything about this picture existing. Unfortunately, none of them have, particularly Archie's relatives. I've talked to them, and some of them that I know of, they are not aware of the picture, unfortunately. So now with this new case study, I want to shift the discussion to talking about different types of a different type of pension file. I alluded to it earlier when I talked about when you have pensions that have been denied, to not fear, because sometimes that's a blessing in disguise when those denied pensions can give you even more information, because usually what happens is there's some kind of rebuttal or back and forth going on to get the claim approved, and sometimes additional information is required. This is one of those cases. What you're looking at is the pension card for my third great grandfather, Monroe Washington. It doesn't have his name, his wife's name, but you can see on the row where it says widow that there's a filing of October 12th, 1918. You have an application number, and what you're missing is the certificate number. And that, as I stated earlier, is one of the big clues that the applicant's file or their pension was denied. But what is great about this card right here is it tells me at the bottom that he allegedly died February 27th, 1910 in East Baton Rouge Parish, Louisiana. For full disclosure, this is the only document that I have, aside from this pension file, that gives me any information about his death. I was never able to find a death certificate for him in East Baton Rouge Parish. So this is all that I have. So with that information from that pension card, I was actually able to order the denied pension file so I could take a look at it and see what happened. I will, at the end of this presentation, I will get into how to order pension files. It's going to be very important for you to know how to get these types of documents. But here's the front of the widow's pension file. Of course, it has Monroe's name on it, the private who allegedly served in Company B of the 8th or 80th Regiment of the United States Colored Infantry. The claimant is Sarah Washington. That's his wife, my third great grandmother. At the bottom here, for under approvals, it shows that it says rejection upon the grounds that the claimant, they basically couldn't show proof that he'd rendered service in the regiment that she stated that he served in. Here's another document that indicates that says claim is submitted for rejection on the ground that soldier's name is not found on the rolls of any company of the 80th United States Colored Infantry as alleged. So yes, this is confirmation that that pension card was right. The claim was denied. So this document is the claimant's declaration for the pension, and this document has some great information on it that Sarah reported here. She states that I'm Sarah Washington. She's age 70, living in Geismar, which is a town in Ascension Parish, Louisiana, which is just outside of Baton Rouge. And she goes on to say that it says that she is the widow of Monroe Washington, who was enrolled under the name Monroe Washington. So she's declaring right here that even though he was a former slave, and we know that some slaves change their names after they become free. She's saying that he did not, that was the name that he went into the service with. And she claims that he enrolled at Port Hudson in 1863 as a private in Company B, 8th Regiment. And in these documents, you'll notice that it goes back and forth from 8th Regiment to 80th Regiment because they were unclear. And mind you, my ancestor Jack Penny, who I just showed you, also served in the 80th Regiment. So it is possible that they, having living with both of them living in the same area, it's possible that they definitely could have been in the same regiment. It says that she was married under the name of Sarah James. So now we have her maiden name. And it says Sarah James to said soldier at Mulberry Ground Plantation in 1867. I know just based on previous research that that's a typo. It's not really Mulberry Ground, it's Mulberry Grove. And I only know that because Sarah Monroe's daughter was Virginia Washington, and Virginia Washington married my second great grandfather, Emmanuel Willis Sr., and he had been a slave at Mulberry Grove Plantation. So I know it's the same place. And by the way, Virginia and Emmanuel's son, Emmanuel Jr., married Artemise Benton, who was the granddaughter of Jack Penny. So I know there's probably a little TMI, but that just goes to show you how connected all these people are in multiple branches of my family. So again, the pension card stated that the claimant filed for that pension originally in 1916. But now we're looking at a document in 1925 from the Baton Rouge chapter of the American Red Cross. Why 1925? Why 9 years later? Because as we know, that pension was denied. So what you've got now is a battle going on for years to try to get this pension approved. And yes, it has taken that long and even longer for Sarah to try to get her claim approved. What this is a letter written from the executive secretary of the Baton Rouge Red Cross on Sarah's behalf, because she is a former slave. She can't read or write. And they're writing a letter to the commissioner, the Department of the Interior, the Bureau of Pensions, to request that she be added to the pension roll so that she can get a pension. As I stated, when you have a rejection, you have additional information that is then provided to try to help get the claim cleared. And what you see here is absolutely fantastic information. It says, "Dear Mr. Gardner, we have been requested by Sarah Washington, widow, to assist her in securing a pension on account of her husband above name, who died on February 3rd. So now we went from February 27th to February 3rd, 1910 in East Baton Rouge Parish. We are unable to secure any definite information from Sarah, who seems to know very little of her husband's military history, as all of the papers were burned some time ago when their house was destroyed by fire." So that's part of the reason why we're running into the problems we're running into to get this claim approved. They said such information as we have been able to secure is as follows. Monroe was born on Red River near Cheneyville, Louisiana, and was the property of Mr. Lynn Tanner. He entered service from Cheneyville and was mustered out in Baton Rouge. The only officers whom he mentioned to his family were Sergeant McFadden and Colonel Hampton. There seemed to be some confusion regarding the organization with which Monroe served, it being given variously as Company F, 10th United States Colored Infantry, Company B, 8th United States Colored Infantry, and 10th Heavy Artillery. The Negroes who have testified in this case are old and ignorant, although well-meaning. The information given by some is more than likely to be erratic. So unfortunately, you're dealing with individuals who are up in age, probably can't remember details accurately. Unfortunately, Sarah's her husband's discharge papers and all of his military records were probably destroyed, that he had, at least that he had in his possession, unfortunately, after he died. But this information here about Monroe being born on Red River in Cheneyville, Louisiana, and the property of Mr. Lynn Tanner, that was huge for me, because Mr. Lynn Tanner, I looked him up. I went looking in obviously went looking in Cheneyville, that's Rapides Parish, and turns out there was a large Tanner family who owned land and owned plantations in that area. Lynn Tanner is his name is actually Robert Lynn Tanner, and Robert Lynn Tanner's sister was Elizabeth Tanner. Elizabeth Tanner was married to William Prince Ford, the same man who at one time owned Solomon Northup, who is the famous character from the movie 12 Years a Slave. So it goes to show that my ancestors were more than likely owned by the same family that owned Solomon Northup. So here we have a response from the commissioner to the executive secretary of the American Red Cross, and he goes on to say, in response to your communication in behalf of Mrs. Sarah Washington, I have to advise you that she has been repeatedly called on in letters addressed to her to furnish the correct name under which her husband served with dates and enlistment and discharge. She should state the correct designation of the organization in which her husband served. And he's basically saying if he did serve under another name other than Monroe Washington, she should state it. And he goes on to say if she is unable to furnish the above indicated evidence, she should make every effort to obtain the names of his regimental or company officers and forward the same to the bureaus. I mean, his tone of his email is not very good. But again, this has been going on for 9 years. So clearly everybody's frustrated because they keep going back and forward and there hasn't been any new information to produce what they're looking for. It makes you wonder whether or not, I know some people think, well, were they deliberately doing this to her to deny her pension? I don't really know. I've wondered that. I've looked, now that a lot of these records are digitized and available online, I've looked through for his name in the National Park Service website because I told you that you can search by name. I've looked there. I've looked at the pension cards to see if there were any other possible applications filed that you might find a file tied to. I haven't been able to find anything, unfortunately, but I've also never made a trip to the National Archives where maybe if I look through the records myself, I might be able to find something. So you're looking at a letter that's dated July 10th, 1928. So we are now 3 years removed from the last letter that I showed you. And at the bottom of this letter, you see the signature of my second great grandmother, Virginia Willis, who has now gotten involved to help her mother. She has written a letter to the Texas House of Representatives member Thomas L. Blanton, seeking his help. She's trying to escalate this to get some movement. She's saying this is to advise you relative to the pensions of my deceased father, the above named Civil War veteran who served in the Civil War for freedom and is entitled to a pension and is dead now, but his widow is living, and we have taken the matter up with the commissioners several times, but we've been unable to receive any consideration. So she's asking for help. Representative Blanton does try to help her by writing a letter to the Commissioner of Pensions, again, just like the American Red Cross tried. And he says, I am closing you here with a letter received from Mrs. Virginia Willis, 158 Grant Street in Beaumont, Texas, which is self-explanatory. I will appreciate it very much if you will kindly write Mrs. Willis and fully advise her in the matter. Kindly send me a copy of the letter to her for my files. So, I can't say that he was too much help, but she got a response. And of course, Thomas Blanton was copied. But again, they come back with, another, unfortunate letter that says, I have to advise you that the claim filed October 12th of 1916 was rejected December 15th, 1917 on the ground that the claimant's husband rendered no United States military service in Company B, Regiment 8 of the U.S. Colored Infantry, at least alleged, or the 80th, or the 10th Regiment of the U.S. Colored Infantry, as shown by reports from the records of the War Department. So they looked through those muster rolls that I showed you and those abstracts of the compiled military service reports, and they could not find his name anywhere, unfortunately. It says repeated efforts have been made to identify the service of the claimant's husband, but without success until further information shall have been furnished showing the name under which this man served with the correct designation of the organization. This bureau is unable to identify the service of the claimant's husband. So without that information, there will be no approval of the pension. And I mean, this is just sad that this went on this many years, but unfortunately, they could not get the help they needed. So this is my second great grandmother's reply to that letter. And this, of all of the back and forth that was going on between the family and the War Department, this was the letter I think that struck me the most in terms of just being able to kind of feel the frustration of my second great grandmother that this pension could not get approved for her mother. If you look at this second paragraph, and maybe the third, you can clearly see that she's kind of at her wit's end. She says, in reply to your communication, please be advised that it is a fact that my father did serve in the United States military service during the Civil War. Like, she's basically saying, regardless of what you say, I know what I know. And she's saying, due to the facts, he often talked to us, myself and my mother, I mean about the generals who were in command of these colored soldiers. I can remember some generals, or some of the officers, namely General Banks and General Burnside. So now she's given specific names. And several other officers he named to me and my mother. And also some of the regiments, colored regiments 80, 81, 84, 87, 90, 95. That's a lot of regiments for one person to serve in. But needless to say, she provided them. And it says, and I can't see, this is where her frustration really kicks in. She says, and I can't see why this claim was rejected. If there is anything that we have not complied with, please advise me of same, and I will be glad to give any information in support of my mother's claim. And also, you state that it was a letter was sent to her under date of June 12, 1925. However, we received that letter, but it was lost somehow ever. But if you would be kind to furnish me with a copy of that letter dated June 24, 1925, I shall be glad to comply to your request. I am truly yours, Mrs. Virginia Washington. So she's doing everything she can to help her mother. So again, because we're dealing with a rejection and the information that the family's provided so far has not been helpful, now we go another step further where the War Department then starts receiving statements, written statements from other individuals who claim to have served with Monroe, which also can potentially give you more insight. In this situation, since they could not find any of his names on the pension, or sorry, in the muster rolls of the different regiments that were mentioned, now they're going back to veterans who served in these regiments who are now trying to vouch for his service. The first one we have here is Celestine Campbell, who states that he was a member of Company F, Regiment 10 of the U.S. Colored Infantry, and was stationed at Fort St. Phillips. And he said he was well acquainted with Monroe, who belonged to the same regiment but does not recall the letter of his company. And he said he heard him answer to roll call and has done guard duty along with him. So when they talk about roll call, they're talking about, remember when I mentioned in those muster rolls, the morning reports where the soldiers would report in the morning that they were present. That's what they're referring to. So they're saying that he claimed he was present, or they witnessed him claim present in the company. I'm sorry, in the regiment, but not necessarily the same company. And the same thing goes for the one below, Filibero, who states he was also a member of the same regiment, and says again that he belonged, that he was acquainted with Monroe, that Monroe belonged to the Company F, 10th Regiment, which of course this information is inconsistent with what Sarah stated. But he says, yeah, he was in my regiment, but not in the same company, but has often heard him answer roll call and saw him often and did guard duty with him at the guard house. Also states that the regiment was split up sometime before the surrender and that Monroe was from Port St. Philip to was sent from Port St. Phillips to some other place, does not know where. We were moved from Fort St. Phillips to Fort Jackson, and Monroe was still in the regiment. States that he never heard of him going by any other name except Monroe Washington. So, you read this and you're just like, wow. Clearly, you've got people here, unless they are all in a plot to lie about it, including Monroe, which makes no sense. They're all saying and vouching and for him and saying he was in our regiment, and for some strange reason the War Department could not find his records. And like I said, I've looked to so far and I haven't been able to find anything. Okay, by this time I'm sure you are dying to know, how in the world can I get my hands on incredible information like this if I find out that my ancestor was involved in the Civil War, served in any regiment, if I find a pension card that shows that he filed a disability claim or that his widow filed for a pension, how can I get my hands on a file like that? So here I have, for your convenience, I have attached a URL at the top, which is a direct link to the National Archives website where you would order these files directly. And what you see down below are the different types of options that you have available to you to order different components of the file. But I will tell you right now, do not waste your time with any other file type other than the second one, Federal Military Pension Application, Civil War, and later complete file, the NATF 85D. The other ones may give you pieces of the file. Some will just give you the military information, but this complete file here gives you the military information, the medical information, and the genealogical information. Yes, I know that the other ones are cheaper, but trust me, the $80 one is worth it. Don't consider any other option other than this one, because I have at least 4 or 5 pensions on my ancestors, and I would have paid $200 each for every single one of them. And I mean that wholeheartedly. It is worth it. So this concludes my presentation on Civil War military files. Please feel free to watch this presentation again if you've missed anything. And thank you so much for your time, and I wish you the best in your research.